Yeah, she's like, that is such a you thing to do. Like, I'm trying to pull you back from stripper and you just push further.
Hi, Edibuddies, and welcome back to the Edibuddies Podcast. I'm your host, Kara. I'm a fiction editor, and on this show, we talk about writing, editing, and the friends you can make along the way. I am super excited about the friend we're talking to today, but before we get to that, we've got a couple housekeeping things. I know I've been gone for a little while. I hope you noticed. I'm sorry about that, but I am back. I have lots of ideas for what I want this new season to look like. Right away, you'll notice that this episode is a lot longer. This is something I'm trying. I really enjoyed this conversation and I didn't want to cut it down and I didn't want to split it up. So you tell me if the longer episode works for you. I'm also excited to share that for the first time, the Edibuddies podcast is now on YouTube. So hello and welcome to all my YouTube friends. There's no video with it currently. It's just a static image. I'm not sure if I'm going to do video. Very comfortable more with audio and the writing side of things. Today we are speaking with Lexi Ryan, who is a New York Times bestselling contemporary romance and fantasy author. She's written over 30 full-length novels and found success both in traditional and self-publishing. But beyond all that, she is just one of my favorite people to talk to about writing. She is so open about her process. She is so empathetic in how she approaches characters. And she just brings a depth of emotional intelligence that I think fantasy and really a lot of genre fiction can benefit from.
My name's Lexi Ryan. I am the New York Times bestselling author, like steamy contemporary romance and sexy action-packed YA fantasy. The fantasy came more recently. I started writing it in 2018, though I've read it forever. And that's been a fun little addition. I like to call it an addition to my career. People will say it's a pivot or a turn, but it really is it's an addition. I still write contemporary romance. I love both. I find that they work different muscles somehow. And yeah, I've been published since my first novel was published in 2009 with a small press. I did a couple books with them. And then 2012, I decided to try self-publishing and I did that for a while. Really got lucky. The timing was fantastic. I have to give, credit to E.L. James because she created this big audience of people who were just hungry for more. And my self-publishing career kind of hit right at that time. And I kind of felt out the market and saw that new adult was doing really well. And I had a book under the bed, as we call those old books that we could never do anything with. I had a few, but one of my books under the bed was a story I just couldn't let go. Like the core of the story, this heroine I had and her deep, dark secrets. I just could not let it go. And I saw what was happening in that new adult space. And it's funny now because now we talk about new adult and fantasy, which is a whole other exciting thing. And maybe we can come back to that later. But
Yeah.
At the time, new adult was mostly like contemporary romance, new adult, college age, or, dropped out of college as my heroine was. So I saw this new space and was like, this is perfect. I'm going to rewrite this book to fit this space. And that's really when I broke out. And that was 2013, May of 2013, that book came out. There are always like moments in a writing career where it's like, oh, that's when I broke out. But then I could point to a moment like a few years later where I'm like, that's where I broke out. And that's where I broke out. But there's a different kind of breaking out. I'd actually, before that book even released, I had left my full-time job. I was an English professor and I'd been lucky enough to hit the New York Times list with Text Appeal, which was like a romantic comedy. And my husband and I decided we were going to take the leap. In retrospect, it was really, really soon, but I needed to. I mean, I was just working myself to death. I was waking up too early so that I could write and then working all day and I had small children. So yeah, it's been a whole journey, but I have been really lucky to write the right books at the right time. Right now, for instance, romantasy is like super hot. And when I fell in deep and decided I wanted to write it. I mean, it was popular, but it wasn't like TikTok wasn't making it everything, you know? So I've gotten really lucky several times. And, you know, this career is, you have to do the work. You have to write the best book you can, and you have to be primed for the opportunity. But luck is just such a big part of it. Having the right book at the right time. And I've had plenty of wrong books at the wrong time. You know, like it's not like every time I write a book, it's lightning in a bottle, but luck just has been on my side several times. And I'm so grateful because it's the dream, really. It's all I ever wanted to do.
You really are. You are living the dream that so many other people like dream of. And I'm kind of curious, before you broke out, what was your writing like? You know, how many attempts and tries did you make before you really found your niche?
Yeah, I love to talk about this because things have evolved a little with self-publishing being such a low barrier to entry. So I started writing my first book when I was in college, and it took me 4 years or 5 years. It took me a really long time to finish it. Now I say to people when I'm explaining this, I'm like, it was a totally different book by the time I finished it. I mean, I think a few times in there, it became a totally different book. So that's kind of what can happen if you drag something out. And that's honestly something I have to remind myself when I want to revise is it's not going to be a better book. It's just going to be a different book. You know,
Such a good point. Yeah.
there is a point where that is the case. We want to make it as good as possible, but at some point it's just going to be a different book. So yeah, that I was certainly writing a different book and then thinking, oh, but if I changed all these things and a different book and a different book. And I was in college and then in grad school. And, you know, it's not like I had consistent time at the keyboard. I'd write on vacations and stuff. I've been writing all my life, but I'm going to write a romance novel because that was when I was in college when I was like, I'm just going to get together a proposal and send it to Harlequin, and I'm going to get this career started. And I was in college then when I realized it doesn't work like that. You have to, if you are unpublished, you have to write the whole book. And so I was like, okay, I better get started because I loved romance. I loved writing. I knew that this, you know, I'd wanted to do this forever. So yeah, I started when I couldn't really be consistent, which is fine. We learn a lot through that first book. I feel fine about how long it took me. I finished it after I was done with graduate school, and there was an award. It's been retired for a while, but Romance Writers of America had an award called the Golden Heart. And it was kind of a big deal. If you were an unpublished author and you became a Golden Heart finalist, like offers for representation would flood in and you'd have publishing offers. Like it was this big deal. So that first book of mine was a Golden Heart finalist. And y'all, if you look up Lexi Ryan Golden Heart, you're not going to find it. That's not my real name. Sometimes I think people are like, she's a liar. No, I write under a pen name. Anyway, so I was lucky enough to be a finalist. And then I was like, oh, you know, babe, my husband has always been like right there as I get these big moments in my career. It's going to happen, you know, like just hold on. So that's 2005. No. It was 2007. I finished it in 2005. 2007, I was a Golden Heart finalist. And I remember it was 2007 because I was pregnant with my son. And of course, crickets, like nothing. And I'd queried this book, and this is back again. So much has changed. I was sending out paper queries. We were like right on the cusp of some people took email queries, but a lot of people didn't. And you were still getting the big manila envelopes to shove your partial in and ship it out to everybody. Like that process. I'm kind of glad I got to experience it like that because I'm like an office supply geek. So even though it was
well, what does that mean?
an excuse to go buy paper and manila envelopes and paper clips, like I love office supplies. Like I'm a paper planner person. So I really, even though it was an expense I really didn't have extra money for at the time, I really relished that part of the process. And I'd read Stephen King's On Writing, where he talked about the tack in the wall with the rejection letters and how it became a nail and eventually the nail fell down. So every rejection letter I was getting in 2005, 2006, I was like, yes, one step closer. Like I just had this attitude about it that I was like, this is part of the process. So then I'm a Golden Heart finalist and I'm like, yes, it's finally going to happen. And by the time I was a finalist, because there's a big gap between you when you enter, and I had another book finished by the time I was a finalist, and they were both romantic comedies because I thought at the time that I was a romantic comedy writer. It turns out I just like to write some funny dialogue sometimes. And that's a big thing. I want to shake people sometimes and be like, don't make the same mistake I did. I was not writing romantic comedy. I was writing contemporary romance. And sometimes my characters were funny, you know? Anyway, so at the time, all publishing wanted, all New York wanted was vampires, maybe a really cool werewolf or a really cool witch. And that summer, I was at Romance Writers of America conference, and I'm walking around, and you have your little tag that says you're a Golden Heart finalist, and people would say, "Oh, that's so great! What do you write?" And I'd say, "Romantic comedy," and they'd go, "Oh, no one's buying that right now," over and over and over again. And then I meet this person, and I say, she says, "What do you write?" And I say, "Romantic comedy." And I know no one's buying it right now, but that's okay because I love it. And I think there will always be room in the market for it. And she said, "Oh my goodness, I think so too. And my publisher thinks the same. And they've given me so much support. And I really believe in this. Don't feel like you have to walk away from it if this is what you love." And that person was Kristen Higgins. This is 2007. Like I hadn't read her books yet. She was brand new. But she will always and forever be in my heart because she's this person who didn't say, "Ooh, sorry about your luck." Like it was like, hey, if you love it, there's space for it. And that's what I needed to hear in that moment. So I like to tell that story because sometimes people only tell bad stories about the authors who've gotten really big. And she is awesome. And of course, we love her books too.
I always tell good stories about you, so
thank you.
I've created a chain.
Well, good. So no offers. Nobody wanted the book. In fact, my whole Golden Heart group, we were all like, "Has anybody gotten an offer?" Crickets. And I think 2 books of all the finalists in all the category, 2 books sold. One was like a historical pirate romance, and one was the one who won the long contemporary romance category. So that wasn't the breakthrough I thought it was. And then in late 2008, this small press was looking for some short stories for an anthology. And it was Men in Shorts was the idea. And I was like, no, the first one was Sex and Shoes. Sex and Shoes was the first one. And then they did Men in Shorts. And I was like, I have this perfect double entendre, like erotic romance. It's really not erotic. It was like a sexy short story. But when you haven't written super, super sexy feels like you're writing erotic, like you're like, oh, this is erotic because it's. So I wrote that and then had an opportunity to write a novel for them. And so I wrote a book called Stilettos Inc., which was like, and imagine like a hypersexual Charlie's Angels mixed with superheroes.
Oh, nice.
So it was like kind of paranormal. I still got to have my fun, quirky characters.
That'd be a great graphic novel.
Oh my gosh, it would be so much fun. I went back to it the other day and I was like, I'm just going to start. Do you mind what language I use on your podcast? Yeah. So I thought I'm just going to start sharing this with my reader group because the poor souls have waited so long for a book from me. And we can talk about that later if you want, but my life's been a little overwhelming. And so all of 23, I didn't release a book. And that was the first time since 2011 that I didn't have a book release. So I thought, so I open it up and the first line is Paige Sykes was horny. Like, I can't share this. Like we changed. And like I write young adult now. And it's not that I wouldn't go there with young adult, but not in the first line. And so I'm like, okay, maybe not. But So I wrote a couple books for them. And it became apparent very quickly that one, it was really hard to write books for a small digital press and also continue to write to pursue my dreams of New York. And two, that I was never going to make enough money with that digital press, at least. Some of them were doing awesome at the time. But with that digital press, at least, I was never going to make enough money to justify the time that it was taking away from my family. And that has always been kind of a rub for me. Like, I love writing. It's part of who I am. But I had a young family, you know, my son was born in 2007. My daughter was born in 2011. So I had to always weigh that out. So I decided New York or bust. I'm out of this digital stuff. I'm just going to keep. So at this point I had the two published books, and then I had three unpublished manuscripts that I'm like hitting my head against New York over and over again. And one of them, which was Text Appeal, Harlequin had for 2 years. And Harlequin has this rule that you can only submit one manuscript at a time. So if they're still under consideration, you can't submit another manuscript, which they get overwhelmed. I'm sure that makes sense. So I kept following up, being like, is this still under consideration? Because I'd love to send you something different. If it's not, oh, we're still considering it, still considering it. At the time, I was like, if I could write 3 books a year for Harlequin, I could probably make 20 to 25,000 a year. And I could probably justify writing full time. That's a really low bar, y'all. That's a really low bar.
Yeah.
But if you've had that dream of, I just want to write full time, I just want to be able to have time for my words, and I need to be able to make enough to pay the bills in the meantime, then you probably understand what that feeling is like. But that was the low bar I was praying for. And everybody else had passed, and I got the rejection from Harlequin in the mail because, again, this was an old query. And they were passing. So I sat in my car and I thought, I need to quit. Like, I need to just let this go because nobody wants it. Digital presses weren't working for me. I'm spending so much time away from my family and I have nothing to show for it. I have all these years behind me. You know, this is 2012 and I finished my first book in 2005. You know, like this isn't something that just, I gave it 6 months, you know, like I just kept trying and kept trying. And the right thing to do for my family is to let this go. And I just bawled because I didn't know who I was without writing. Like I couldn't think of what life looked like if I really let it go. And I have never been the kind of person who was content to write a book and stick it under the bed and move on to the next one. There are people like that, and their art is just as valid as anyone else's. But for me, the magic of writing and storytelling is in the connection. And that's what I wanted. I wanted the connection. I wanted readers, however big or small. And I wanted to make enough money so that I could justify the time it took to write stories for those readers. So I didn't even make it out of the car before I decided I was going to try self-publishing. And at this point, like I said, 2012, I have friends who were Golden Heart finalists back with me in 2007 who had gone through the whole traditional publishing thing, decided that they weren't getting a fair deal with it and choosing to walk away from New York deals for self-publishing. And I thought, well, if they can do that, then it must be legit. This is not the same thing that it used to be. I had no desire to hand sell books. I will not be the person that's walking around your Kroger parking lot and being like, here, let me tell you about my book. Like, I would rather, so many things I would rather do. So,
yes,
yeah,
understandable.
It's just not happening. So, you know, so suddenly there's this whole route that doesn't involve hand selling your books that you can go. And every penny I'd made from that digital publisher, I think I had like $1,100 from the 2 short stories and 2 books I wrote. So not great money, but it was something. I tucked it away in a savings account. So that was my starting investment to start self-publishing because I wasn't in a position to take money from the family account. So that's what I did. I started with Text Appeal in summer of 2012. It was a very, very slow creep up. And then I decided to give myself a birthday gift of buying a BookBub ad. This is like people didn't know about BookBub. It was very new, but not so new that it wasn't effective. And so I bought myself a BookBub ad for my birthday, and it ran in January of 2013, but my birthday's in February, and hit the New York Times and made a nice chunk of money that I was able to pay off some debt with. So yeah. And so from there, you're tweaking your process and your marketing, and this works, and you're getting in more groups and talking to more people about how you make this work. I went in with the plan of writing a series and setting the first one free so that people would read through, because that seemed to be a magic plan. To this day, I use that strategy. When I talk to people who are like, I can't sell, I'm like, have you tried free? Because with text appeal, part of what made that magic happen was I wrote a short story with the purpose of cannibalizing it for introducing people to text appeal. So it was a free short story. And at the end, you can't do this as much now because they have rules about what percentage has to be the actual title. But at the time, I didn't have those rules. So it was about half short story, half the first 3 chapters of text appeal. And it was free. And so people would grab it and they'd read that, and then they'd go on to text appeal. So yeah, so things evolved, and it got to the point where by the time I broke out with Unbreak Me in 2013, I was given a couple traditional offers, and I said no. I walked away, and my agent earned a lot of my loyalty because he said, okay, I get it. And then when I shopped another series in 2015, because I thought, I'm going to try this again, I shot my Black Hawk Boys series, and I got an offer that was ridiculously low. And he said, consider it, sleep on it. I never tell people to immediately walk away from money, but this is obviously not a logical choice for you. Like this doesn't make sense. He makes no money off my self-publishing unless he sells audio or foreign rights, or, I don't give him a cut. There are some agents that I have feelings about it, but that work out a deal that they get a cut of the royalties, self-publishing royalties. That's not the way my agent and I work. So the fact that he stood by me twice when I walked away from traditional deals, and I wasn't like, oh, I'm self-published or nothing. I knew from the get-go when we started talking to each other about possibly working together. I was like, when the time is right, I want to have a traditional deal. Well, it turned out that the math does. My daughter is 12. She'll say the math ain't mathin'.
Math ain't mathin'. I know it.
It just didn't. Like, how on earth how could they compete? Now, it's a different market now because TikTok has like really blown up that print market. So I think there's a different conversation to be had now. But at the time, print sales were kind of lagging, especially in new adult. The majority of your sales were going to happen in ebooks. Your traditional publisher is going to give you 25% of net, which is 25% of what you would make on your own, just to make that clear. So I've like, the math ain't mathin'. Like, it just did not make sense until I fell down the rabbit hole and became obsessed with all things Fae. And yeah, and then I was looking at the market, and I was looking at fantasy and YA fantasy and how things were packaged and how things were marketed and whose hands they were getting into, and decided I want to write YA fantasy. I want to, and it's interesting because I actually think I appreciate the packaging of adult fantasy more now, but I think that the charge has been led by YA fantasy authors who have come over into the adult space. Like Holly Black, Sarah J. Maas, goodness, Cassandra Clare did too, I think. Like there's just this whole, and I think that with them, they brought the branding I prefer. I mean, so I was like, okay, I feel like if I go traditional, I can get my books in the hands of the readers that I want this book in the hands of. And it was kind of a passion project. I mean, at this point I had 28 contemporary romances out, so to be like, okay, now I'm ready to write some YA fantasy, it wasn't exactly what everybody thought was coming next. unless they knew me and spent time around me and knew how obsessed I was. so, so I talked to my agent. I said, hey, I gave him one line. I said, I'm writing a story. A teenage girl goes to ferry to rescue her sister from an evil fake king, and she has to make a deal with him and ends up like in a love triangle between two princes from opposing courts. Am I crazy? Like, I kind of want to write this book. Do you think that there's a market for it? And he was like, immediately 10 editors come to mind who would love to read the proposal. Do it. We'll stop it. And then I wasn't sure if I'd be able to sell on proposal because I'd never written fantasy before.
Yeah.
And I was lucky that I was able to. Things might have been different if I'd sold a full, but that's a whole other thing. Yeah. So I was able to sell on proposal. I was able to sell it for enough that I felt like I could justify the time away from my sure thing income of contemporary romance. And it's been really fantastic. Like, I've just gotten really lucky. My timing's been good. I've been lucky enough to have some really talented influencers on TikTok read my stuff and talk about it. That's why These Hollow Vows was the first book in the duology, and it came out in July, but hit the New York Times in October. And that was because of TikTok. My first print run wasn't enough to get me the New York Times. It just wasn't. So TikTok did its thing. And I'm grateful because it kind of changed everything. It changed the way they treated book two. It changed the way, gave me opportunities to write another duology in the same world. It's so fun when success is reader driven, the true success I feel like always is, if it's not just like a one flash in the pan, because it's written by the superstar, like actress or actor or whatever, we're going to get it everywhere. But like true long, career longevity success seems to always be reader driven, but it warmed my heart because I'm a reader too, like I too have the books that I'm like, you haven't read that. You have to read that. Oh my gosh, let's talk about it. So I love seeing that. And then to see it work for me too. Oh, it was really, really humbling and awesome and exciting and scary. I told YA Twitter this was Twitter then, it wasn't the X or whatever it is now.
Right.
But they have a reputation for being a little harsh. So I told my friends that I was out as soon as I got my first negative tweet about the YA fantasy series. And the negative tweet was really just somebody who'd gotten an arc like in November of, oh my gosh, I have to do year math here. So the book came out in 21 and 22. Yeah. So they were sending arcs out the prior October. So she got it in October or November of 2020. Is that right? Okay. Yeah. And so anyway, she's looking at a year and a half before book two comes out. And she was so mad, understandably. Like some people don't like cliffhanger. It was a big cliffhanger. But I was like, that's it. I'm out. So to this day, I have no idea what my Twitter password is. I emailed my assistant.
That was all it took.
Yeah. I was like, I don't need to get in that bad headspace. And I was like, if it's going there, I don't want to be here. So I said, change my Twitter password, right? That I'm away, that I'm on hiatus, and change my password and don't tell me what the new one is. So I realized I could get in if I wanted to, but I don't want to.
Yeah. You were just an early, you were an early lever.
Yeah, early exodus.
Yeah. You jumped ship. It's so funny because I read These Hollow Vows and I was about 3/4 of the way through and I was like, I have a feeling this is not going to end in a way that is going to be satisfactory to me. And I was correct. And I was really glad that I had already made sure I had the other book on its way so that I didn't have to have a pause in the middle. But, yeah.
And so I love cliffhangers, but I know that even though they're really effective, there are a lot of people who are like, they don't love them. And a year between books, the cliffhanger is really rough. I mean, I've written cliffy romances before that, if it's the same couple and there's a cliffhanger, you're getting them the next book within 3 months. right? So a year is a really long time, but that's also just the way it works. And
Yeah.
there's no way I could have done it if I was trying to produce more than one fantasy a year, because I am still trying to keep my romance career alive, because I love both. I mean, like, just don't make me choose.
That's a different type of fantasy and romance. So let's talk about that a little bit, because you were writing pretty much exclusively contemporary romance, and then you were like, I love reading fantasy. I see this opportunity in the market. I'm going to try writing in fantasy. So what did you kind of learn, or what changed about your writing when you kind of shifted your genre?
Okay, yeah. So choosing how I wanted it to be published and how I wanted it to be packaged was more about the market.
Mm-hmm.
My decision to write it was more about the world was a dumpster fire and I was a mess inside. I had some personal stuff going on. There was just, I needed to kill bad guys. And that was what took me down I can't read enough, dissociation by way of fantasy novel after fantasy novel after fantasy novel. And when I read enough of something, my brain just starts click, 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 click. We want to create stories with our favorite pieces and a new way to do this thing. So one of the things that I wanted to take a new way of doing, I don't know if I accomplished it or not, but I am fascinated by the idea fated mates versus free will, right? So, and fate versus free will has always been a big fantasy trope. But I've always liked this idea of the fated mates. I'm like, no, I don't. Okay, I'm just going to say it. Court of Silver Flames made me angry. And if you haven't read it and you don't want the spoiler, maybe just like turn down the volume for a minute.
Spoiler here, beep.
Yeah. I was pissed when I found out that they were mates, because she was awful. And we've all been awful before.
I have not read it. I'm just telling you. I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
No. I do not. I have had so many people talk to me about it. I'm not worried whatsoever. Like, okay. You can, I
think anybody who reads enough Sarah Maas is like, of course they're mates. Cause like, that's something she takes she talks about her husband as her mate, like her fated, she thinks of it that way. So of course it's something that's very important to her. But to me, I was like, Nesta is so awful, but she needed to be loved despite being awful. And we all need to be loved despite being awful. And then when they were mates, I was like, well, he don't have a choice. He wants her anyway, because he's like built that way. So I've always been, now that came out after I wrote these Hollow Vows, but it like struck home, because that's something I'm always coming back to, is like, oh, I love the idea of people being fated to be together, but isn't it better when we choose to be who we want to be with? And I'm sorry, this is a little deep, but my husband and I have always been very big. Staying married is a choice. And if you don't believe that it's a choice, if you believe once it's done, this is for us, not for you, dear listener. If he believed once it's done, him being with me would not be meaningful to me, right? The decision to be in my life and to continue to be in my life, despite the fact that I have Nesta days too, that's what's meaningful. And that's what makes me want to be better and do better for him and be a better partner, and my decision to be in his life. So I'm really big on the free will when it comes to romantic partners, but it's also really cool when they're like, there's something in the threads of fate that's making it happen. So I'm definitely interested in that. And that was playing a role. Circling back to the question, you were asking, did I notice that anything changed in like my writing?
Yeah. Or like things that you discovered over the course of switching to this genre that you hadn't really like known as a writer before.
Maybe not explicitly. I mean, I had big imposter syndrome, like bad. I wrote the first draft of the first book in Comic Sans.
Why?
It was a thing going around Twitter at the time. It was like, if you are stuck and you have writer's block, write in Comic Sans, because you cannot take yourself too seriously in Comic Sans. And it's true.
Okay.
It works.
All right.
I did not finish it in Comic Sans. And of course, I changed it back to Times New Roman before I sent it to anyone. I have some pride. But yeah, it was a thing that was like going around Twitter at the time. Like, try the Comic Sans trick. And I would be like, this thing was like plotted beyond anything I'd ever plotted before. I'm not a plotter, but I submitted a very long partial with a 20-page synopsis when I sold this. So I knew it wasn't that I didn't know what was going to happen. It was just like, I'm not worthy, like I don't really know. And I still struggle with that a lot. I like to remind myself and tell myself, maybe I'm wrong, but I like to tell myself that it's not that I don't write fantasy correctly, but that I write it in a way that's maybe more accessible to people who haven't always read it. And that is my aim. I might or might not hit that. But if I tell myself that's my aim, then I don't feel quite as nervous that my contemporary romance voice is going to come through, because it's okay that it comes through, because it's a romance, and a Lexi Ryan book is a Lexi Ryan book, whether it's set with magic or in a bar,
I'm curious what you think is the correct way to write fantasy. Because I don't know what that is or what that would look like.
I am very intimidated by, even things like the complicated names.
Oh yeah.
Like, I can read it and I'll do fine, but I'd be like, should I do something here that's more like fantasy looking? But that's not me.
All your characters have like 4-letter like nicknames. I think every single one, because you've got like Bree and Bass and Finn and it's all 3 letters.
Jazz has 3.
Yeah.
Though, so he breaks the trend. Yeah, no, I laugh because my real name is Leisha, and it's spelled really funny. And so I named my kids, nobody can ever spell my name. And if they can spell it, they can't pronounce it. So I named my kids Jack and Mary. You can't get it wrong. This is how you spell it. Although occasionally people will spell my daughter's name like Mary and Merry Christmas. I don't understand that. But anyway, I do think I am partial because of my own experiences. I'm partial to those short and clear names. It's not even that I believe that there is a correct way and a wrong way. It's that when I'm getting in my head about it, when I'm feeling insecure about what I bring to the story, I can start to tell myself lies like that there is a right way and that I don't have access to the tools because I have all this experience, but it's in another genre. I'm pretty comfortable and pretty confident writing a contemporary romance. So, writing that, especially that first one, I was leaping out of my comfort zone and it was a lot of fun. I had a lot of fun writing that, but yeah, for sure had to contend with some imposter syndrome.
Yeah. What kind of, because you were reading a lot of that type of stuff at the time, did you do a lot of research into fairy folklore to inspire you?
Yeah. So I don't even know if I call it true research. I spent a lot of time going down rabbit holes online, right? So yeah, Wikipedia is my friend. I donate to them every year because and so what I would do, I would look up these mythical creatures, I was really interested in mythical monsters. That probably comes from, a D&D background. My brothers would always play D&D and I was the little sister who would sit on the stairs and watch them. And to this day, my husband plays D&D. I find it doesn't suit me because I like stories to have a story arc. And sometimes in D&D, you don't get that. I'm like, but we spent all this time making these characters and are we not going to develop? Or I just find it a little frustrating because I want it to be something else. But I have that background. So okay, now we're on our way to do this. But first there's this monster and digging into mythical monsters, some from fairy folklore, some not. And then, you go down the rabbit hole to this version and then this version and then this version. And then what's beautiful about writing fiction is you take what you want and change what you want. So again, the ability to not be at risk of getting it wrong was kind of awesome. So I spent lots of time running down rabbit holes online and just finding things. Oh, I definitely want to include that. Oh, I love that. How can I include that? How can I make this part of it? And then it's like writing fae in some ways. It's like writing vampires, because there is like a lot of mythology out there that doesn't match up, right? So you have to make your decisions. Can your vampires go out in the sunlight or will they die? Do your vampires, is it a pretty blood sucking or is it a gross blood sucking? Like, so you have to decide, can your fairies lie? Can they use iron? Can they sit on iron? Do they live under the hill? Like you just have to decide which pieces you want to take. And if the pieces that you're not taking are something that you want to address, that you want your world to have, I really enjoyed that in A Court of Thorns and Roses, that Feyre went into this world believing things about the Fae that were just all wrong. Specifically, like, they can't lie. That is not true, but it was really clever of whoever told humans that because look how much easier it is. Then you have Holly Black's Fae, who really can't lie. And she's so clever. The way she used that to tell her story and to work that romance and to show the characters. I mean, and to me, Fae should be like incredibly clever. They're Fae. They should be so clever. And so I really love Holly Black's Fae because I think they are the most clever of all the Fae I've read. And I just really appreciate that. So yeah, you have to go through the mythology and decide which pieces you want to take, which pieces you want to leave, which pieces you want to twist. And that's a lot of fun. It's a playground.
Yeah. And you had a lot of fun with it, like clearly. Mm-hmm. And you're still having fun with it because you're still working in that.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you want to talk a little bit about what's coming up next? And
yeah. So I was able to write another duology in the same world. So the first duology was These Hollow Vows and These Twisted Bonds, and that came out a couple years ago. And then this coming summer in July, we will have the first in a new duology. The first book is called, I don't know if you do video or not, but I grabbed an art copy. It's called Beneath These Cursed Stars. Yeah. And that comes out in July, and the sequel will come out the following July. It's a new duology, but this one is set around different main characters. So this is 3 years after the end of These Twisted Bonds. Jazelyn is Bree's little sister, and in this book, she is grappling with a lot of darkness inside of her. Like she just wants to get revenge on the guys who tortured her while she was in captivity with Mortius. And she has a ring that gives her the kiss of death and makes no one remember her after she's been around them. And so she wants to go on this crusade to kill all the bad guys. And hey, maybe Mortius has been resurrected. If that's true, she definitely wants to kill him too. But her sister's super protective and would never let this happen. So it's about her. And then it's about the shifter fairy that she sends in her place to the Wild Fae territory as her. Because her sister wants her to go there and stay safe. And she's like, I want to stay here and hunt these guys down. I'm going to send her name's Felicity. I'm going to send Felicity in my place. And so you get dual stories. You get Jazz as she's going through the Unseelie Court, trying to hunt down Mortius and find out if he's really alive. And her love story because she ends up reuniting with the guy who was in the cell across from her when she was in captivity with Mortius. And then Felicity, who's in the Wild Fae territory with Misha, and he thinks she's Jazelyn, and they're falling in love, and she needs to find his Hall of Doors so that her people can get where they need to go to fix all the bad things happening in Allura. So it's been, oh my gosh, such a journey. The books they were an adventure. I kind of kicked myself, of course, 100 times for doing the dual timelines because
Oh, yes.
But as soon as I thought of doing it that way, I knew there was no other way to tell the story, and, yeah, I had a lot of fun. Jocelyn's story is a little darker than Bree's, and her journey is a little bit darker, but just like when I wrote Bree's story, it was like, I needed to write this book. I needed to tell this story for me, if nothing else. But again, I like an audience, and Jazz was the same way, like it's a little heavier, but I hope in all the best ways. And man, two swoony heroes, that was fun. And not for the same girl. This is not a why choose. This is two swoony heroes for two different girls.
I don't know that I could handle any more of the why choose kind of, or any kind of the love triangle after what you put us through in the last two.
What's so funny is after These Hollow Vows came out, I had a couple people message me on Instagram, and they were like, now I know you write love triangles, but just so you know, there's this whole other genre where she doesn't have to pick one.
I really wondered if that's where it was going for most of the second book. And then I was like, well, Misha's around. I'm liking this Misha character. Let's throw him in there. Why not?
Misha. Yeah, I love Misha.
Oh my gosh. That's so great. I'm so excited for July. That's my birthday month too. So I'm going to make sure I get a copy on my wish list.
Oh, thank you so much.
I want to switch a little bit because we've talked a lot about your writing, but I do also, because I'm an editor and this is the Edibuddies podcast, I'd love to talk about editing a little bit specifically.
Sure.
So you were self-publishing for a while. At what point did you start using editors or start implementing?
So with the first book, I was operating on a skimpy budget. So I hired a proofreader and then had a couple friends proofread it as well. To me, those are the I don't want the oops errors in there. Later, I went back and hired another proofreader. To me, you can't get enough eyes on a book. But so then I hired an editor for the next book, but it was like a kind of a friend situation where I was helping him out. He was helping me out. It was kind of a deal, but maybe not his actual career. And then with Unbreak Me, I got a line editor. So we were creeping closer, right? And no, it was Wish I May. Unbreak Me again, I got a few proofers, actually. A beta reader and a few proofers. And then Wish I May, I found a line editor. And by the time I started the next series in that same world, I had the same line editor. I worked with her for years. I miss her dearly. She just doesn't work in the business anymore. Sometimes it's easier to do a 9 to 5. I mean, that's,
for real,
you know how it is. When you're an editor, it's like everybody wants you at once and then nobody wants you. And then, it's frustrating, and darn writers can't make their deadlines for anything. So yeah, by the time I got to the next series, so that was late 2013, I was using a line editor and a content editor, a line editor, a proofer. And that is pretty much my preferred. I like to have a content editor and then do line edits, copy edits, depending on what you would call them. I notice Trad and Indy tend to call them slightly different things, but it's really the same process.
It's depending on which editor you're talking to as well.
Yeah. And then I like to have a couple rounds of proofing. I find that it's hardest to find people for the proofing step.
Really?
Not because there are tons of people who proof, but very few people who understand what their job is at that point. At that point, your job is not to change my voice. Your job is not to go through and decide that, this sentence would be sharper if we wrote it in a different way. That's not your job. Your job is to find the errors, right? And so when I find a good proofer, I hang on tight, because I actually like to go through a couple stages. I don't have an eye for catching missed words. And yeah, I like to have lots of people look at it, but I think every single step in that process is important. And I've been really lucky to have people that I've worked with for so long, because you get a trust, like you just trust them after you've worked with so many books. And there's a knee-jerk reaction when somebody is like, your baby isn't actually that pretty, to get a little defensive, and the longer you've worked with someone, the faster you can go through that process of mental pushback, even if you never reach out to them and say, oh, but, I would just let myself sit on it so I could get over it. But the longer I work with someone, the faster I get over it. And if I don't agree, I don't agree, but there's a trust. And so I've been very lucky to be able to work with the people I have for so long. And then I went to trad, and I had 4 editors over my first 3 books. Yeah. And that's just, unfortunately, that's part of the business. People move on, they change careers, they go to another company, they take a promotion, whatever. And, I'm hoping that the editor I was with for the last book and the editor I'm with now, that she sticks around for a while. She's kind of, I don't remember her title, but she's kind of a higher position. So I should have a better chance of keeping her for a while, but you just don't know. You can't count on anything. So what I found was it was really hard for me. I would get through a book and finally feel trust in that editor. And then I was working with someone different. And so it was hard to establish that trust quickly enough that you could have a new editor on each book and still feel confident in what they were telling you to do. That's it's the nature of the beast sometimes. When you get really lucky, you get to work with the same person for a long time, even in traditional publishing, but you don't necessarily, and you can't predict what's coming. So that was hard, but I like to think that I grew a lot in my ability to kind of put my pride to the side. It's always hard. It's there. I am a prideful author. We have to be, because otherwise we'd never have the guts to put our work out there. But it's a very important skill to be able to say, okay, you're going to sit over here for a while we contemplate what this would look like. Right. And sometimes the changes that I'm most resistant to are the ones that once I revise, I am most happy with. So, experience helps too. I have a lot of books behind me. So it helps that I know that sometimes it feels like this, and that feeling like everything in you coiling tight and resisting does not mean that it needs to stay exactly as it is. It means this is scary. You worked really hard to make it what it is, and you're being asked to make it something different. Okay, that's okay. It's all right that feels scary, but just because it feels scary doesn't mean that it's wrong. And so I feel like I've had more practice trying to get myself through the series of grief that comes when you get a strong revision letter. And hopefully I've gotten better at it. I love revising. I do think that helps. I always feel like that's where I try to draft really quickly because, well, I'm going to rewrite it anyway. So if I'm going to rewrite it anyway, I might as well make the first round just fast and dirty.
Yeah.
So I try to draft really quickly because I am a reviser. My process is lots of quilting, coming back, and I write pieces out of order, whatever I know, and then I put it in order and I quilt it all together, which requires a ton of rewriting. The better you get at it, the more you realize that you need to be really sparse in your details that first time, because if you don't know where it goes, there's no point in describing the thunderstorm that's happening on the Sunday afternoon, right after, and then it's a Sunday
relevant.
So you just learn how to embrace your process and deal with it in a way that makes more sense. But I like revising. I really feel like that's when my books become really good. So I get excited about revisions, but that doesn't mean I'm immune to that instinctive pushback. I have to get there, but usually I get there. And once I dig in, I really enjoy rewriting. Maybe too much. I could rewrite forever. Deadlines save me from that.
But like you said, it goes too far at a certain point for sure.
Mm-hmm. It does. It does.
So how would you say when you started working with editors and now, you've been through this process and you've had editors that you've chosen and you've had ones that you just kind of got to find, how would you say working with an editor has elevated your writing or, what have they really done for your books?
Oh my gosh. So much. The first time I worked with a line editor, it was Rhonda Helms, and she's the one who's not in the business anymore. But the first time I worked with her and she went through and highlighted all my echoes, I was mortified, like mortified. I like a heavy hand from an editor finding echoes.
What is an echo? I'm not familiar with that term.
Like, so you use the same word three times in 2 pages, or worse, 3 times in 3 paragraphs. Yeah. And sometimes it can't be avoided. Sometimes it's an artistic choice, but a lot of times your mind just thought of that word. So it's still grasping onto it and it's going to give it to you, even sometimes when there's something better.
Yeah.
So going through that process the very first time made me more aware of it. And I think I've gotten better over time. I still have echoes and I still really like a good line editor who finds them, because though they can be kind of painful to pull out and fix, I don't like hearing them, like my husband listens to my books on audio. And if I'm in the car and I hear an echo, I'm like, oh gosh, I wish I could rewrite that, So that was the first thing, because that was the first like real any level of content editorial I did. And then I found with my indie editors that you had to be able to identify who did what well. So I had my line editor was very good. If I paid her for content revisions too, which I started doing, she was very good at seeing scene level things that needed to be changed and the continuity through the scene, but also just like the emotional arc in the scene and making sure that was consistent and making sure it makes sense. And then my editor, Lauren, I always feel like is good at the higher level story structure stuff. And so I think it's important to know what your editors do well so that you can match them up to kind of cover for each other. Because the truth is everybody has their strengths, right? So you just want to like take people who have different strengths and have them all work on your book. And gosh, I'm trying to think, what did I learn from working with them on content stuff? I've learned to be, I guess, a little more careful in the way we say a lot of things in our lives that are like a little insensitive. And a good editor will call you out on it and be like, this is ableist, or this is sexist, or this, whatever. And a lot of times it's something that you just, of course you didn't mean anything by it, but keeping it there is still harmful. So I really appreciate that kind of thing too. And again, sometimes it means changing your precious words and you're like, oh, I think you're right, but got to do it. You just got to do it.
Yeah.
So I just really appreciate an editor's ability to back away, because as a writer, it is so hard. And as a career writer, you are always under deadline. So you're always so close to stuff. You don't get the advantage or the opportunity to, put it in the drawer for 6 months and then come back and reread it and then see, okay, how do I feel about this now? That's not my personality anyway, so it wouldn't really work well for me. But we as a career writer, you're just always, what's next? What's next? What's next? And that sounds bad, but it's really, it's a privilege. It's lovely. But it means you really have to lean hard on people who do have perspective, because they haven't had their nose right in it for 6 months. So, that's the ability, understanding and trusting the ability of this outside person to see your vision and to help you make it better. Because frankly, like if you are like, what's the theme of your book? I'd be like, I don't know. Here are things that I liked. And he said this swoony thing, and then this happened. Like I don't think of it that way. But then like once I get years back from it, I can be like, oh man, I hit that theme over and over again. Because then I have distance. But a good editor is going to be able to see those things and help you make sure that the story aligns with them when maybe you weren't even aware that you were doing that, where you couldn't make it align perfectly because you didn't even realize you were doing it. So yeah, I've just really, man, a good editor's worth everything.
No, it's really true. And it's funny that you say that, because I will be reading something that a client gave me and be thinking to myself, do they realize what they're putting into this? Like how much they're revealing maybe about something personal, or like clearly something that's like on their mind that they're like, we're using this to work through. And I don't think a lot of times we are when we're writing something. And I've come back to things that I've written, like 2-3 years later, because I'm one of the chicken shit ones that won't publish. And but I'll come back to it, 2-3 years later, and I was like, well, I was dealing with stuff at the time,
Yeah, I mean, like that's part of the terror of being a writer. Like you're just putting yourself out there. Like, yes, our characters are their own people, and yes, they are different than us. But it's impossible to write without revealing the way you see the world. Even if you're writing an unreliable narrator who kills people for fun, Dexter, like that. I don't think Dexter was actually an unreliable narrator, y'all. Sorry. Serial killer be a reliable narrator?
Yeah.
But you're still revealing something about the way you see the world. And you have to kind of be okay with that and separate yourself from it. And I think it becomes a little harder for me, at least. I'm 43. I've been writing since, well, forever, but I've been writing the novels that are out in the world. There are pieces that came when I was 20 years old, right? I've changed, a very different person in a lot of ways, and life's changed me. I don't see things quite with the rose-colored glasses that I used to. And so I think for me, it's harder to see the stuff that I reveal in the old me, but that's okay. That's why I never opened the old books.
That's one way to deal with it, right? Just don't let.
Yeah, that's one way. It's avoidance. Head in the sand.
Yeah. But you're so right. And when that makes it even more complicated when you're working with an editor, because you are making yourself vulnerable in that way, And I recently worked on a project that was a memoir. And so there's this whole other layer of like, not only are they're like literally trying to reveal themselves and like talking about their personal life story. And you have to approach it with so much care, because it is their baby. But sometimes the baby's really dirty, and it needs to be.
And I just find that I think I just have a different take on like presenting myself to the world. Like maybe just because I've done it for so long, I see it differently. But I have a friend that if I send her, I have this idea and it's going to have this character who this and this character who this, and she'll write back and she'll be like, do you think your sisters will be okay with you writing books that are so closely tied into who they are? And I'm like, but it's not them. Who cares? But she's right. Some people, I mean, in fact, my sister Kim is one of those people that every book of mine she reads, she's like, that's me again. She's a single mom. It's me. She has issues with her dad. It's me. And I'm like, no, like maybe knowing you has helped me understand those things, but it's not you. But this friend of mine is very concerned about that all the time. And I think she does the same thing. She sees herself and she's like, is she writing about me? No. If you have any question and know me, I'm not writing about you. I may have used a kernel of something about you to help me understand something about the character, but I'm not writing about you. I'm writing about a character. So, I mean, to just the difference between being a person who's like, well, of course, it's not that person that I know, even though they have these things in common, and being the person who's like, ooh, are these people in my life going to be uncomfortable when they read this? I mean, and we've all, if you write sexy in any way, that people, that's one of the first questions they want to ask you, like, well, does your husband help you research? And I'm like, do you want to talk about your sex life right now? Like, that's a really weird question to ask someone. Do you sext your husband from work? I like, what's happening here?
Yeah.
But it's a very common thing because, oh, well, it's autobiographical, or no, we're going to take what we know. We're going to take things that move us one way or another in life, and we're going to tie them into these characters so that we can understand the character as a fully formed human, not just like a two-dimensional thing on paper.
Right.
And I don't know if I was also like, I was an English major, so I was a lit person, and I've read, so much of across the board.
This is your native language, your native way of relating to the
world. And I love TV. I just love story.
Yeah.
And I'm also a person who, I think that I do not care about author intention. I don't care. I had a reader write me the other day, and dear reader, if you're listening, I'm not going to reply, so you don't need to nudge me again. She was like, hey, I love your books. Here's all the reasons I'm a big fan. I've read this particular book several times, and I am really struggling with these things. And I was hoping you could put some questions to rest for me. And she essentially went through some decisions that this character made and why she didn't agree with them and why she was uncomfortable with them and what she thought the character should have done instead, and really, really wanted me to reply and explain myself. I don't believe art works like that. You do not get to be over the shoulder of every reader and say, oh, no, you made a face. You were supposed to laugh there. Like that's not how it works. Yeah. If you read it, and her reading was definitely different than my intention. She read it that, this character made these decisions for these reasons and didn't agree with those reasons. And I'm like, yeah, I don't either. That'd be terrible. But I don't get, if I didn't succeed in making that her reasoning clear, to me, that conversation with the author is totally irrelevant. Yeah. It's a different text, right? What's on the page, what's published, that's the art, that's the text. It is separate from me. And, maybe that's like snobby, but I really feel like it's like a detachment from the ego, right? That I feel like is necessary to have a career, to be like, nope, it's done. It's out there. I am under no obligation, nor do I want to go around explaining myself. It makes me think of my brother. Well, I have two brothers who are artists. The brother who did the map in These Hollow Vads duology, he had this painting that he shared some pictures of the painting he'd done. And I wrote him and I said, oh my goodness, I think I know what moment in your life this painting is based off of. I think this was when this happened. You got this letter about this. And in the painting, he's turning on a light. And I feel like that's symbolic of his like epiphany moment of what's really in this relationship. And so but I have these questions, and his response, I was probably in college. And his response was, thank you so much for sharing that. That's really interesting that it made you think all of those things, and answered none of my questions. And I was like, okay. And I honestly, this email, I thought about replying in that way. Like, yeah, thanks. It's really interesting that my book made you think of all those things. I chose not to engage for several reasons that I haven't even got into here, but sometimes no response is better. But yeah, I think maybe that's part of why I can feel more okay with how exposed and vulnerable I am, is because I do believe it becomes its own thing and it becomes detached from me once it's out into the world.
Yeah. I've always heard that reading is really an act of co-creation between the author and the reader.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And you cannot be responsible for what somebody takes away from what you wrote, because they're bringing their own thing into it.
Yep. Yeah. And we all do. And I mean, if you think about like sexy literature and different kinks people explore, that's like probably the most bald, obvious way we can talk about that, right? Like we all have things that we I have certain authors that I'm like, oh, I love what she writes, but then sometimes she goes here and I can't.
Yeah.
I can't with daddy. I can't.
When daddy shows up, I'm gone.
Like, hey, could you just like go into the Word doc, do a find and replace and send it to me, because that's ruining it, but I love your work and I want to read it. But that's not the story they wrote. So I don't do that because that's not right. Yeah. But, and like that's kind of a somewhat vulgar example. But it's just, that's very obvious, right? Like what we bring, I bring my own tastes, I bring my own icks, I bring my own whatever. And that affects the way I read the story. It affects the way I read the choices characters make. I try really hard as an author because I am obsessed with taking characters who make choices that we would not make ourselves and making the reader understand why they made those choices. I just feel like that's part of the human connection thing, right? I heard about this little junior high girl. It was at my nephew's like dance, and a bunch of them had snuck up to the weight room above the gym where the dance was being held. And they went up there to see what was going on. And this girl is on her knees and all these boys are in a circle around her, as bad as you think it would be. Right. And so my first thought is, what on earth was she thinking? Why would she make this choice? How can I don't know her. I don't know her family. So how can I imagine this story and this situation in a way that makes me understand and sympathize with this character and her choices? We might not agree with the choice. We still be like, oh, I really wish you hadn't done that. Yeah. It makes my mama heart really sad, really, really sad. But I still want to understand as a human, right? Because I think that we become better humans when we understand each other or try to understand each other in the moments that are hardest. And so that moment becomes a backstory for one of my characters, a backstory for Grace and rushing in. So it's very important to me that I share as much as possible, convince the reader to understand this character and to not judge the character for their decisions. Or if they judge them, to do so in a maybe more open-minded way. So I do take it very seriously, but sometimes people bring such heavy baggage to a topic that it doesn't matter what you write. It's when the conversation, one side's a little louder than the other. And that's okay. That's life. That's who we are. That's why when we read a book at one point in our life, we're like, can't, I'm out. Yeah. Absolutely not. And then we revisit it 20 years later and we love it. And it's the best thing we've ever read. Yeah. I love that idea. The conversation. Yeah. Co-creation. I like that a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what you said I think that romance in general does so good about like developing those relationships and creating emotional stakes. And a lot of that comes from that empathy and that compassionate view of, what if you see somebody in a position like that, what if instead of instantly assuming that person's a loser, that person is, just a failure who's never going to go anywhere, what if you ask the question, wow, like what would have happened? What would have had to happen to me in my life to have found myself
in that position? Yeah. Why would I make this choice? Yeah. I have my very first critique partner likes to laugh about the fact that I was writing a book once about a stripper, and she was like, I can't feel sympathy for the stripper. I just can't, and she's like, and I was like, you know what? You're right. Because of this particular person's journey, I need her to feel shame. I've never met a stripper that felt shame, and I don't particularly think they need to. But this character, part of her journey was the shame. You're right. Stripper's not right. She's a prostitute. But, and again, sex workers shouldn't feel shame either. This particular character in her journey had shame because of how it all happened. And yeah, she's like, that is such a you thing to do, to be like, I'm trying to pull you back from stripper and you just push further.
I I love that though. That's what you gotta do, when it's right, it's right. Okay, well, I know we've been talking for a while and I want to be respectful of your time. We talked about your new book coming out. Where should people check you out? What books should they start with? Just where can they find your stuff?
Yeah. Find me on lexiryan.com. And as I mentioned, I love names that are easy to spell. So it's just Lexiryan. And you can find all my books there. If you are a fantasy reader, I would say start with These Hollow Vows. If you are a contemporary romance reader, I have so many, but I usually send people to The Wrong Kind of Love, which is the first book in my most popular series, the Jackson Harbor series. It is a standalone, but it's a series that focuses around a family that owns a brewery the coast of Lake Michigan. So yeah, depending on what you like.
Just as the final question, is there anything that you've been reading recently that you would like to recommend?
Oh, I love reading. I think I mentioned that's a big reader. So recently I finished Nine-Tailed, which is a fantasy romance. It comes out, it's by J.C. Lee, I believe. I read an early copy. It comes out July 9th. It is a beautiful story. She just revealed the cover the other day, and the cover is as beautiful as the story. Very action-packed, sexy. She's going places with this series. Loved it. A Fate Inked in Blood comes out at the end of February. That is Danielle Jensen. She did like the Bridge Kingdom series. Yeah. And this is like Nordic mythology, and it's really cool. It's really, again, fast paced, sexy, things that I love. I've been clearly on a fantasy kick. I've recently I finished The Ashes of the Star-Cursed King, which is the second in the Serpent and the Wings of Night duology. It's like fantasy vampires, but not contemporary world vampires, fantasy world vampires. And I finished Divine Rivals recently. I haven't read the second in that series, which I think came out recently. I was a little behind, but it's really good. The writing in both of those is impeccable. Just really, really strong prose. And I appreciate that. I really enjoy. I feel like I have to wrangle my prose so much that when I listen to, I love audiobooks. So when I listen to prose that I feel like it's so smooth and lyrical, kind of naturally, I just admire it all the more because I have to fight for it.
So if you are looking for some romantic fantasy with names you can actually pronounce, you can check out These Hollow Vows at lexiryan.com. I promise you, her prose does not read like she had to fight for it, but I think that is a feeling a lot of writers can relate to. So if you're looking for an editor who is ready to jump into the fight with you, check out my website at midwrite.com or my Instagram at midwriteworld. That's MIDWRITE world. If you enjoy the podcast, please leave a rating and review on your preferred podcasting service. And of course, if you have any ideas for topics or guests, send them my way at edibuddieспod@gmail.com. Next month, we are diving into the world of literary fiction and literary thrillers. This is really outside of my wheelhouse, which is great because it means I have a lot to learn. And I hope that you will join me. See you next time.